In a Toronto suburb, Mark Carney brought back EV rebates and provided a shock to utilities that produce electric power.
In the coming weeks, our government will unveil a new electricity strategy to double, I'll repeat, to double our grid capacity.
Prime Minister Mark Carney's plan to double Canada's electrical grid capacity is not simply a national energy announcement. It is the moment Canada redraws the industrial map of North America. A country that already runs one of the cleanest and most reliable power systems in the world is now preparing to scale it at a level that outpaces every province, every utility, and every assumption about what Canada's economic future will be built on. The contrast is immediate. At the same time Manitoba Hydro cautiously unveiled its next decade of incremental expansion, Carney stepped forward with a declaration that Canada must prepare for an electrified economy that grows far faster than past models predict. His message lands in a moment where the United States, under President Donald Trump, is retreating into fossil fuel priorities and freezing major renewable energy approvals. Canada, meanwhile, is planning the opposite. Expansion, stability, and industrial competitiveness built on clean electricity. Carney has set a new pace, one the rest of the continent is now forced to follow. And the financial scale of this pivot is enormous. Early economic modeling suggests that grid doubling could help Canada capture between $300 billion and $500 billion in new investment, industrial development, and clean power export opportunities over the next 2 decades. The backdrop for this clash of visions began with Manitoba Hydro's 10-year plan. The province intends to improve aging hydro stations, add 3 natural gas turbines in Brandon by 2030, and purchase power from Indigenous-owned wind projects expected to be online by 2035. For a utility shaped by more than a century of dam building, it is a steady and familiar approach: manage risk, upgrade capacity, and avoid overextension. Then came Carney. Speaking in a Toronto suburb, he announced that Canada would unveil a national electricity strategy to double the grid. His tone was not aspirational, it was categorical. The country, he argued, must build the power system needed for an industrial base that is transforming faster than traditional planning models can absorb. EV production, clean steel manufacturing, AI data centers, large-scale battery operations, and hydrogen technologies are no longer hypothetical industries. They are arriving now, and they demand power at a scale Canada must be prepared to deliver. Manitoba's plan may guide a province. Carney's plan is designed to anchor a nation. And anchoring a nation means anchoring massive capital flows. Doubling the grid could generate tens of billions in new electricity export revenue, with year-over-year benefits potentially reaching $20 billion to $40 billion annually once surplus clean power begins flowing into U.S. border markets. Canada already operates one of the cleanest electricity grids in the G7. By doubling capacity, Ottawa effectively shifts this advantage from environmental virtue to industrial leverage. Modern manufacturing, especially EVs, aerospace, digital infrastructure, and critical minerals processing, depends on clean, reliable baseload power. Investors are increasingly unwilling to build billion-dollar facilities in regions where electricity is unstable or politically unpredictable. Under Trump's U.S. policy shifts, countless wind and solar projects have been stalled or canceled, and utilities warned they cannot meet surging industrial demand. Carney's plan positions Canada as the stable, scalable alternative. It tells global industry, you can build the future here because the future's power supply will not be in doubt. This reliability dividend has monetary value. Corporate site selection analysts estimate that access to predictable clean power can shift industrial investment northward by tens of billions of dollars, especially in sectors like batteries, AI data centers, and aluminum or steel manufacturing. The split between Canada and the U.S. is no longer theoretical. Trump's administration has tightened permitting rules for clean energy, revived fossil fuel dominance, and created uncertainty for corporations planning long-term electrification. Power prices in several U.S. states have climbed. Reliability concerns are rising. Canada's move toward grid expansion, by contrast, ensures predictability. Interprovincial links will be strengthened. Large clean power corridors will support heavy industry. And provinces that embrace private renewable investment will integrate faster into a national framework designed to encourage, not obstruct, growth. For the first time in decades, Canada's regulatory environment appears more forward-looking and more attractive to global companies than America's. If the U.S. continues down this path, analysts suggest the American economy could absorb indirect costs of $100 billion to $250 billion per year from higher energy prices, lost competitiveness, and increased reliance on replacement fossil fuel generation. This energy divergence is already reshaping corporate strategy. EV manufacturers face uncertainty in the U.S. as federal rebates fluctuate and tariffs scramble supply chains. Canada, meanwhile, restored EV incentives and is building the power and charging infrastructure required for mass adoption. AI and cloud computing giants evaluating sites for new data centers are paying attention to Canadian stability. Carney's strategy gives them a long-term guarantee: clean, abundant electricity without the political turbulence dominating the U.S. energy debate. Clean steel and aluminum production, critical for defense and aerospace, also depend heavily on non-emitting electricity. The more the U.S. leans on natural gas and the more Canada expands hydro, nuclear, and renewable capacity, the clearer the industrial advantage becomes. Canada is not waiting for the U.S. to modernize. It is preparing to win the sectors America risks losing. And as firms move, so does capital. Grid expansion could help Canada attract an additional $150 billion to $200 billion in large-scale industrial investments by 2040, assuming current electrification trends continue. Carney's grid ambition is part of a broader strategic shift. Canada is deepening ties with Asia, Europe, and emerging clean tech partners. Ottawa is positioning itself as a dependable power supplier in a world hungry for stable, low-carbon energy. Doubling the grid is Canada's declaration that it intends to be an energy superpower in practice, not just in rhetoric. As Trump prioritizes fossil fuel dominance and bilateral pressure tactics, Canada is constructing the foundations of sovereignty, a resilient industrial base with its own electricity, its own minerals, and its own supply chain stability. Grid expansion strengthens every other strategic move Canada is making: defense procurement diversification, critical minerals development, EV strategy, and trade realignment. This is not just about electricity, it is about independence. And independence pays. By reducing exposure to U.S. volatility, Canada could avoid billions in economic losses during future tariff disputes or supply chain shocks, an insurance effect that economists increasingly quantify as a strategic advantage worth tens of billions annually. If Carney succeeds, Canada becomes the default site for electrified industry in North America. Power-hungry technologies will cluster where energy is clean and predictable, not where political cycles dictate supply. Cross-border electricity exports could offer leverage in future trade negotiations, and the U.S., if it continues down its current path, may eventually face a dilemma: invest massively to catch up, or accept that the center of gravity for clean industry has moved north. Canada's strategic advantage grows every year the U.S. delays modernization. And if the U.S. ever experienced a serious disruption in Canadian energy imports, replacement costs could easily exceed $170 billion annually, the current value of Canadian energy exports the U.S. relies on, showing how deeply American industry depends on Canada's stability. Manitoba's decade-long plan reflects the past. Carney's grid strategy reflects the future. One is incremental, the other is transformational. Doubling the grid is more than energy planning. It is a declaration of how Canada intends to survive and succeed in a world defined by electrification, industrial competition, and geopolitical turbulence. While the United States argues over whether to build the future, Canada is already wiring it into place. The continent's energy race has started, and Canada isn't just running, it's leading. And because of this lead, the long-term economic value for Canada could surpass $500 billion, while the U.S. risks hundreds of billions in losses if it cannot keep pace or preserve access to Canadian power and energy supplies.
I think that what is really, really important to remember is that first and foremost, the auto industry is victim of the tariffs, of the American tariffs. And Stellantis' decision to move production from Brampton to the US is completely unacceptable. So we're suing Stellantis because basically we had a deal, they broke it, and we want our money back.
Canada has crossed a line it rarely crosses. Ottawa is now suing Stellantis, one of the world's largest automakers, after the company abandoned its production commitment in Brampton. And according to Industry Minister Mélanie Joly, this crisis didn't begin in Canada at all. It began in Washington, with Donald Trump's tariffs blowing apart North America's auto supply chain and pushing companies into decisions that hurt Canadian workers. This is more than a corporate dispute. It is a moment where Canada is openly defending its industrial sovereignty and pushing back against the economic chaos that Trump's trade war has unleashed. The confrontation escalated when Stellantis shifted Jeep Compass production from Brampton, Ontario to the United States, cutting roughly 3,500 Canadian jobs. In response, Mélanie Joly made an unusually blunt statement on national television. "We're suing Stellantis because we had a deal. They broke it. We want our money back." That sentence set the tone for Canada's new approach: firm, unapologetic, and very public. The deal Joly refers to involves the multi-billion-dollar Next Star battery project in Windsor, a joint venture between LG Energy Solution and Stellantis. Canada agreed to support the plant with generous incentives, but only if Stellantis upheld its commitment to keep production in Brampton. When the company walked away, Ottawa filed a notice of default, the legal precursor to a full lawsuit. What makes this case even more political is the way Joly framed the cause. She stated plainly, the auto industry is victim of the American tariffs. In her telling, Stellantis didn't suddenly fall out of love with Ontario. The company reacted to the shockwaves coming from Trump's tariff regime, a regime designed to pull manufacturing back into the U.S., even at the expense of America's closest trading partners. The lawsuit marks a turning point in Canada's strategy toward U.S. economic pressure. Trump's 25% auto tariffs, reinstated and expanded when he returned to office, were intended to force companies to shift production into patriotic compliance with American industrial policy. But the outcome has been far messier. Integrated supply chains, especially those connecting Ontario, Michigan, and Ohio, are unraveling under the strain. Reuters and Bloomberg both reported sharp price increases and production declines in the U.S. auto market, along with strong criticism from American auto associations. Canada, meanwhile, is refusing to simply absorb the damage. Joly explained that protecting Canada's auto industry means taking a firm stand. She reminded viewers that the sector supports 125,000 direct jobs and more than 500,000 overall, making it the single most economically significant manufacturing ecosystem in the country. Losing one plant is not just a political embarrassment, it is a threat to the long-term stability of the national economy. She said she would not allow a floodgate of automakers leaving the country. If Stellantis could break its deal without consequences, other companies might follow. That is why the lawsuit matters far beyond Brampton. At the same time, Canada's broader strategy is shifting. The Carney government has grown increasingly skeptical of relying on the United States as the country's dominant economic partner. Ottawa has expanded trade talks with Asia, deepened defense and industrial cooperation with South Korea and Japan, and taken steps to diversify exports of aluminum, steel, and energy. Canada is behaving less like a dependent neighbor and more like a mid-sized power choosing where and how it engages. While Canada is asserting itself, the United States is dealing with its own fallout. Trump's tariffs, which he described as necessary for American prosperity, are now hitting American wallets. New vehicle prices are rising. U.S. automakers are warning of up to 2 million fewer vehicles sold this year. Business groups in Michigan, one of Trump's key political bases, have criticized the tariffs as destabilizing and harmful. Jolie seized on this point and stated that Americans now understand tariffs are simply taxes and the burden is falling on consumers, not foreign governments. The geopolitical layer makes the situation even more complex. At a recent U.S. congressional hearing, some American officials accused Canada and Mexico of becoming potential backdoors for Chinese materials entering the U.S. market. Jolie rejected that insinuation and reaffirmed Canada's consistent engagement with U.S. regulators. Her comment reinforced a larger message. Canada is playing by the rules and defending its interests, while the U.S. is projecting suspicion outward to deflect from its own policy failures. Inside Canada, there is also a political dimension. Jolie criticized the Conservative opposition for refusing to form a Team Canada front against U.S. pressure. She reminded Canadians that during the NAFTA renegotiations years ago, political unity was essential. The subtext was clear. At a time when Trump is reshaping North American trade with unilateral tariffs, internal division weakens Canada's negotiating position. The lawsuit against Stellantis, therefore, becomes not only an economic tool, but a political message about national unity. And beyond the political theater, there is a deeper shift happening in how Canadians understand their place in the North American economy. For years, there was an assumption that access to the U.S. market was guaranteed, reliable, and stable. But the Trump era has shaken that belief to its core. In community after community, Canadians are beginning to ask whether tying their economic future to American political volatility is still worth the risk. Ottawa's decision to hold Stellantis accountable signals a new confidence, a belief that Canada can and must protect its industries even if Washington disapproves. There is also a growing recognition that Canada's value to the global economy is rising. Critical minerals, battery supply chains, renewable power, artificial intelligence, and clean industrial capacity are sectors where Canada is now attracting international investment. The Stellantis lawsuit fits into that narrative as well. Canada is telling global companies, if you want access to taxpayer support, you must respect the commitments you make. If you break them, there will be consequences. This is not just about Stellantis. It is about setting new rules for how Canada conducts itself in the next decade of industrial policy.
Canada's lawsuit against Stellantis signals a profound shift in how the country navigates economic conflict with the United States. No longer content with polite diplomacy and private negotiations, Ottawa is responding to Trump-era industrial pressure with legal force, public accountability, and a readiness to fight for its own economic future. This is only the beginning. Stellantis may choose to negotiate, restore jobs, or challenge Canada's claims. Trump may escalate tariffs further. Supply chains may tighten or fracture, but one outcome is already clear. Canada is no longer playing defense. It is actively shaping the terms of its economic destiny. The real question now is whether Trump's protectionist agenda can withstand Canada's pushback, or whether the political story he built around bringing auto jobs back to America is already starting to unravel. The next few months will reveal whether this lawsuit becomes a defining case in North American industrial politics.
On Friday, Chinese President Xi Jinping held back-to-back meetings with the Prime Ministers of Canada and Japan, signaling Beijing's intent to ease recent diplomatic tensions with both nations. At the meeting, Xi extended an invitation to Carney to visit China, describing it as an opportunity to continue dialogue and explore areas of mutual benefit. The Canadian leader welcomed the offer, saying it represented a chance to continue the dialogue in a constructive way.
Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney has just achieved a quiet but remarkable diplomatic breakthrough at the 2025 APEC summit in Gyeongju, South Korea. The gathering of world leaders was meant to discuss trade recovery and supply chain resilience, yet the real headline emerged from two back-to-back meetings: Xi Jinping's talks with Carney and Japan's Sanae Takaichi. While Donald Trump left the summit early after declaring his America First agenda fulfilled, Beijing stayed and recalibrated. Xi's calm tone stood in sharp contrast to months of tariff friction and tense diplomacy. For Canada, the moment was both symbolic and strategic, proof that a nation long overshadowed by its U.S. neighbor could carve its own path in Asia's reshaping order. Mark Carney arrived at APEC with one objective: rebuild Canada's economic flexibility. After a year of industrial losses tied to U.S. trade disputes, Ottawa needed new partners and new momentum. The meeting with Xi Jinping, though brief, validated Carney's wider Asia strategy, working with South Korea, ASEAN, and Australia to broaden Canada's network before the 2026 USMCA review. At the Jeonju session, Canada's presence stood out. It was no longer a secondary participant following Washington's lead, but a country pursuing its own balance. Diplomatic officials confirmed that discussions touched on trade coordination, clean energy cooperation, and reopening ministerial channels frozen since 2018. No headline deal emerged, yet the tone mattered: measured, respectful, and open to rebuilding trust. For Carney, tone itself was progress, the first sign that dialogue could replace defensive rhetoric. China's outreach was deliberate. After a year of slowing exports and capital outflows, Beijing began stabilizing relations with mid-sized economies. Engaging Canada helps diversify partnerships within the G7 and demonstrates to investors that China can still manage diplomacy with Western nations. It also acknowledges the limits of confrontation. Officials in Beijing framed this shift as pragmatic recovery. Rather than competing for dominance, China is courting predictability. For Canada, that shift opens practical lanes: cooperation in food safety, clean technology, and mineral supply chains that both sides need. For China, it restores a measure of credibility within APEC after years of disputes over detained citizens and export restrictions. The gesture is small, but in Asian diplomacy, small gestures often start bigger realignments. Xi's second meeting, with Japan's Sanae Takaichi, followed the same tone: cordial, brief, but deliberate. It showed Beijing testing a selective détente across the region. Japan, though closely aligned with U.S. security policy, depends heavily on stable trade with China. Both leaders discussed maritime cooperation and managing long-standing disputes in the East China Sea. Together, the two meetings reshaped the narrative of APEC 2025. They marked the first synchronized attempt by China, Canada, and Japan to moderate rivalry instead of escalate it. For Carney, this multipolar atmosphere creates opportunity. As the world splits between tariff walls and security blocks, Canada positions itself as the pragmatic bridge, small enough to talk to everyone, credible enough to be heard. By the summit's end, no joint statement changed the rules of global trade. Yet something more valuable occurred: a reset in tone and trust. The APEC images of Carney and Xi shaking hands captured a turning point for Canada's foreign policy, from a defensive stance to active diplomacy. Carney's approach shows that influence is not measured only by tariffs or GDP, but by composure and persistence. Amid U.S. volatility and Chinese recalibration, Canada found room to maneuver. If this cautious engagement continues, it could lay the groundwork for new trade corridors across Asia, defined not by ideology, but by stability. The Gyeongju summit may fade from headlines, yet its meaning endures. In a world of escalating economic confrontation, Canada quietly proved that dialogue still works, and that sometimes diplomacy's smallest gestures can mark the biggest shift.
This is Hanwha's KSS-3 submarine, launched into the sea just in time for the Prime Minister's visit.
Very agile.
Mark Carney climbed down 7 meters to check out what the South Koreans want Canada to buy.
When you walk through the Hanwha Ocean Shipyard in South Korea, you can feel the weight of industry. Towering cranes, welding sparks, and steel hulls taking shape on the water. It is one of the largest shipyards in Asia, 5 square kilometers of pure precision and ambition. And in late October 2025, amid that metallic rhythm, one visitor stood out: Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney. Cameras followed him as he toured the submarine line that could soon redefine Canada's Navy. Hanwha Ocean is one of 2 finalists competing to replace Canada's aging Victoria-class submarines. The South Koreans promised 12 new KS-3 boats, 4 by 2035, if a deal is signed by 2026. That single image, Carney standing among South Korean engineers, carried more meaning than a press statement ever could. While Donald Trump was in another city, warning allies to buy American and tightening tariff walls, Carney was moving in the opposite direction. He was in Asia, exploring technology and partnerships the United States could no longer offer. For Canada, this wasn't just a defense procurement trip. It was a declaration of independence, an unmistakable signal that Ottawa is no longer waiting for Washington's permission to modernize.
The story behind Carney's visit runs deeper than submarines. It reflects a global realignment, now visible from Ottawa to Seoul. In recent years, South Korea has earned a new nickname, the Arsenal of Democracy. Once a nation rebuilt from the ashes of war, it is now on course to become the world's 4th largest weapons exporter. Korean firms have delivered artillery to Poland, tanks to Australia, and air defense systems to NATO allies. Now, they are bidding to build Canada's next fleet of submarines, a contract worth between 20 and 24 billion US dollars. What makes Seoul's offer so attractive is speed and partnership. The KS-3 submarines are already operational for the Korean Navy. They can be built within the next decade, using advanced robotics and modular construction. The proposal even includes technology transfer, crew training, and the creation of maintenance facilities on Canadian soil. It's not a one-off transaction. Seoul's Deputy Defense Minister has called it a long-term partnership aimed at strengthening Canada's own defense industry. That approach stands in sharp contrast to traditional American deals, which often keep production and intellectual property inside the U.S. border. For Carney, the choice is symbolic. By engaging South Korea, Canada is signaling to the world and to Washington that it will not be confined to a single industrial orbit. It is building new supply chains and friendships in Asia, where technology and cooperation come without the constant shadow of tariffs and political strings. To understand why this moment matters, we need to look at what's happening on the other side of the Pacific. Since returning to the White House, President Trump has rebuilt his economic playbook around protectionism. Under the America First agenda, his administration has imposed sweeping import taxes ranging from 10 to 100%. Canada has been hit particularly hard, facing a 25% tariff on most industrial goods and an additional 10% on energy. For Ottawa, those measures have disrupted trade worth over $120 billion annually. Instead of retaliating, Carney's government chose a more strategic path. It began shifting Canada's defense and technology partnerships towards Asia, where nations like South Korea and Japan were eager to cooperate without political tension. That shift is not just economic. It's geopolitical. Every submarine Canada builds with Seoul, every maintenance contract it signs outside the U.S. is a quiet rebalance of power. It chips away at Washington's decades-long dominance over North American industry. In short, Trump's tariffs have accelerated exactly what he hoped to prevent: the diversification of Western allies away from U.S. factories. By pushing partners to the edge, the White House has forced them to find new routes, and Canada is proving that independence can be a strategy, not a risk.
It's hard to miss the symbolism. At the end of October, both Donald Trump and Mark Carney were in South Korea, but for entirely different missions. Trump met President Lee Jae-myung to finalize a $350 billion U.S.-Korea trade framework focused on reshoring and tight supply chain control. Carney, meanwhile, visited GOJ, where Korean engineers built submarines for their own navy. Two Western leaders, one country, two opposite visions. Trump came to enforce American terms, Carney came to forge new ones. One relied on tariffs, the other on trust. This contrast captures the fracture in today's Western order. The old model, Washington dictates, allies follow, is breaking apart. Canada's outreach to South Korea represents a new approach, where middle powers collaborate directly and trade capability, not obedience. As Trump's motorcade departed Seoul, Carney's team entered Hanwha's shipyard. For historians, it might mark the week Canada stopped orbiting Washington and started steering its own course in Asia.
A year ago, Canada seemed like a casualty of Trump's trade war. Tariffs on steel, autos, and lumber cut exports and threatened jobs. Economists warned of long-term damage. But by late 2025, the narrative has flipped. Instead of pleading for tariff relief, Canada is rebuilding through new alliances. Deals with Japan, South Korea, and Australia now anchor its industrial strategy. Partnerships that share technology instead of imposing restrictions. The submarine talks are more than procurement. They represent who controls the engines of innovation. If the deal goes through, it will bring thousands of jobs, advanced robotics training, and new supply chain opportunities inside Canada. More importantly, it proves that Canada can prosper outside America's shadow. Trump's tariffs tried to isolate Ottawa, but instead propelled it toward a network of Asian democracies eager for cooperation. Government officials expect the first submarines by 2035, the same year the USMCA review is due. By then, Canada's defense network could stretch from Vancouver to Busan, not just from Ottawa to Washington. The message is clear. While the US builds walls, Canada builds bridges. Partnership has replaced dependency. Strategy has replaced fear. And as the clang of steel echoed through Hanwha's shipyard, it symbolized something larger than a contract. The moment a nation reclaimed control of its industrial future.
From afar, it might look like an ordinary diplomatic visit. But in the global story of 2025, Carney's stop in South Korea speaks volumes. It shows that alliances are shifting and that middle powers like Canada can redefine their destiny without waiting for Washington. In a world dominated by tariffs and trade wars, this submarine project isn't just about ships under the sea, it's about a country surfacing with a new sense of confidence. Because while others build barriers, Canada is quietly forging steel, and with it, a new path forward.